Okay, I'm here with Holly and John Perry. This is an interview on Zoom as part of our pandemic series. Holly and John, I'm going to ask you each some questions about your beginnings and your career, and then we'll talk about your life together in Annisquam. So starting with you, John Curtis Perry. You are the Henry Willard Dennison Professor Emeritus of History at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Tell us a little about your career beginnings and how you developed your focus on East Asia and maritime history.
A kid of 14, I guess I was. I decided I wanted to be an ambassador when I grew up. And I thought, well, I needed a little experience, but more important, I needed some cash. So I went and started telephoning people at embassies. You know, there used to be the yellow pages, the classified section of the telephone book. And so I started dialing embassies, Argentina, no, sorry, we have no job. Belgium, no. China, oh yes. Well, we might have an opening. You better come over and we'll just talk about it, have a look at you. So I was lucky, I got a job there, summer job, which had extended actually for 2 summers, working in the embassy, learning how embassies work. I used to carry the mail to the post office. That was one of my chief functions, as I was a messenger, essentially. That was a category of jobs at that time. And if you looked at a newspaper, you'd always find that as one of the job opportunities available. So the postmistress there got to know me very well. She always called me China boy. And it seems that that would be important. I learned a few words of Chinese, and that sort of stuck with me. And then when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I was majoring in history, but I decided to focus on China, in part because of the Korean War. It erupted in 1950 when I was about to be a junior. And I decided I wanted to learn some Chinese. Language classes usually started in fall, and this was in late fall, just about to be winter, and I had to go to the registrar and persuade the registrar that he should start a class in Chinese. So I had to run around and recruit some classmates who would be willing to join me in this venture. So that's when my work on China began academically, and it turned into a major in Chinese studies. And I think I was the first person in the history of Yale College to choose such an exotic major, because anything to do with Asia was really odd. Yale was so focused on Europe, particularly England, that Asia seemed really quite, I would say, an exotic ghetto for scholars. But anyway, I did that, and then stayed on for another year of graduate work in foreign area studies. And then I joined the United States Navy, and I was sent to Japan. And so, of course, I couldn't go to China at that time. We had no relations with China, obviously. So I got interested in Japan. When I got out of the service, I focused my study more on Japan than China, and started my career teaching East Asian history, first at Connecticut College, and then at Carleton, where in Minnesota, where I was for about 10 years or so, teaching these courses more and more emphasizing the American interaction with these places, which were much more less exotic as time passed. And then the opportunity came for me to work at Harvard for a while doing some research, and a job sprang up at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, also connected with Harvard. And I ended up teaching there for 35 years. And during that time, I moved from American East Asian relations into maritime history. I went global, so to speak, and have been studying the impact of our relationship with the salt water ever
For instance,
since.
do you have any experiences with students? As an anecdote or something with students in terms of teaching, or a particular student or anything like that?
Of course, I have many dear friends now who are 40 or 50 years younger than I.
Yes.
And that's one of the exciting things about being a teacher. By my age, of course, there are very few still around, but my life is enriched by that. But it's the collectivity of the enterprise and the fact that in these seminars, I was able to bring together people of different civilizations and backgrounds to talk about problems that we have in common, the question of leadership, for example. And I think, important in bringing Russia into the discussion at Fletcher. We had no interactions with Russians when I came there, but I was able to build a program that brought Russians to the campus. But I think the most exciting thing probably was bringing North Koreans together with South Koreans. It was quite a challenge because I don't know of any other academic meeting in which nationals of those two countries got together. Subsequently, I went to North Korea. We had a small delegation. There were 6 of us, 2 Americans and Japanese and I. And we spent a week in North Korea, which was a gripping experience. I remember we stopped in Beijing on our way because we took the train into North Korea from China instead of flying in, which we were happy to do because it gave us a view of the countryside, which otherwise would not have been the case. I stopped in our embassy to pay my respects to our ambassador, Winston Lord, who was actually a Fletcher graduate. And he said, remember, if you get into any trouble at all in North Korea, there is absolutely nothing we can do to help you. But then he said, have a great trip. Goodbye.
Holly mentioned, this particular course that you took at Harvard with this famous scholar, and it made me wonder if you could talk about, in your career as a scholar and historian, particular people that might have had an influence on you, and if you could talk about them a little bit, or him or her.
Yeah, sure. There are a couple. One at Yale was named Chitoshi Yanaga. He was born in Hawaii, and it was a big thing for the Japanese American community in Hawaii that this Japanese American would have a professorship at Yale. He was kind of a trailblazer for the Asian American community in the islands. And I learned a lot from him about, I did study Japanese history with him, and he became a lifelong friend. But I learned a lot about how Japanese feel about their own culture. Learning about someone's culture from someone who's part of it, as well as reading interpretations of that culture by others, was extremely enriching. Another person who was a big influence on me was Edwin O. Reischauer, who is the Dean of Japanese Studies at Harvard and a brilliant lecturer and a man who had the ability to make complex issues easily understandable. And to the horror of some of his colleagues, he would even write for the Reader's Digest if he thought that was a way of getting his ideas across. And he was a very successful bridge, I think, between the academic life and a broader life. Fortunately, Jack Kennedy knew about him largely through a friend and co-author of a book with me, Jim Thompson. And Kennedy appointed Reischauer to be our ambassador to Japan. And we saw him while we were there studying. And his influence on my thinking, I believe, was quite great. He had a nice sense of language. And one thing that I appreciate was his economy of words. And he did not exaggerate as people so often do today. Nothing for him was awesome unless it was somehow godlike. If you asked him about an exam, he might say, "Oh, you did a good job." That meant an A. And I could appreciate that attention to nicety of language.
So you've written many books, and I'm going to list some of them. Beneath the Eagle's Wings, Americans in Occupied Japan, Sentimental Imperialists, the American Experience in East Asia, Facing West, Americans and the Opening of the Pacific.
I've always wanted to explore certain things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a dilettante. I'm not a scholar. I don't dig in generally to the archives for my work.
Uh-huh.
I like to take archival work, books based on archival work, and try to turn them into a broader canvas that might be attractive to more people. That's always been my objective. So, I don't consider myself to be a scholar.
Sarah Hollis French Perry. You grew up in Annisquam in the Summers.
Summers, yep.
And you had a long career at Polaroid, working for Edwin Land, while at the same time developing your unique vision as an artist. Would you tell us a little about your working relationship with Mr. Land and something about Mr. Land himself?
Well, maybe I should go back a little bit because I took the test for IBM, which was, it paid the best entering amount of any job you could get. And so I took the test and I was admitted, I was accepted at IBM. And so that was my first job. And I was a programmer. At IBM at that time, the women did the work and the men worked on commission and sold great, wonderful ideas to companies that wanted it. And then back in the lab, we would be wiring. And I liked that because it was spatial relations and it was somewhat logic and math. And you didn't have to have any advanced math to do it. So it was actually a wonderful job for me. So I went home and wrote a letter to Land and said that I would like to work there and that what I was interested in. And he called me in for an interview. And in the interview, he said, yes. He said, he said, I don't have a job title for you because that isn't the way we hire people, and they make their jobs. You do what's good for you in this company, and there are lots of opportunities. And before we left, I said, well, maybe we should just talk a little bit about my salary. He said, well, what are you making now? And I told him, thinking, that would be the end of it. He said, oh, we can match that, fine. So there I was so thrilled. It was May. I think I just met you.
Yeah.
About
Again.
that time.
Again. Yeah.
Again, yes, that's right. So I went and took the job, and the first thing they did was they sent me off to Yosemite, and I took a wonderful 10-day long, it was 2 weeks, I guess, seminar workshop with Ansel Adams. And I went and I spent the night at the Adams house before we went up to Yosemite. And I'll never forget Ansel at the piano. He was a wonderful pianist, and he played all evening. And so I went and spent that time in Yosemite. And then Land was looking into how the eye saw color. And so I spent quite a bit of time making arrays of colors, like we called them mondrians. They were usually just sort of, you take all kinds of small areas of color and put them all together, and then photograph them and look at them with different filters. And it was just a study of how color came to be. But in the beginning, when I was first working there, it was wonderful. He'd send me out, and usually I'd go with some other young worker, and we'd each have 2 cameras, and we'd be taking the same picture with 2 different films, same camera, or 2 different cameras, same film, and that sort of thing. And then we'd come back and we'd put together charts that would show him what we'd learned or what we thought we'd learned. And often we could take it into the lab, and we could have the various zones of the picture. This was all black and white in the beginning. We could measure them and draw curves of what the black areas were saying and the white areas were saying, and whether it was a straight curve or this kind of a curve that told you how the camera film was reacting to the light. He used to come to Ennisquam, actually, on the weekends in the summer.
I don't know if I can articulate this, but I'm almost seeing a theme from when you started at Polaroid. The idea that you have a way of engaging existence through your perception of it, through your experience of it, and creating things out of that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I think it was one of the things I did was I did a lot of knitting, which is weird, but I knitted New York Times bags into a slipcover for a really comfy chair that you could sit down in and read the paper. That was one. Another one was, I knitted, what do you call them? These plastic bags into
Sleeves.
into sweaters for trees, and the idea being that the newspapers that were brought in these bags were chopped up trees, and you were somehow putting the bag back onto the tree. It's one of its progeny or ancestors have provided it for the comforting nature of the bag. turned into a lovely sweater. And I first one I made was I put on a cherry, what do you call it, choke cherry tree in our yard here in Annisquam.
Your collaboration with your daughter, Rachel,
Yeah,
who is a very well-known artist. And I gather that your artistic careers are very tied up with one another.
we had an opportunity. There was a competition for people to make art for the Tisch Library at Tufts University. So we made a suggestion for a piece. Beautiful. It had a big, huge kind of a gallery. When you walked in the door, there was this barrel vault, and it was kind of empty, and there was a library desk on one side and a few offices on the other side, but there was a big open space. It was really beautiful, and they were looking for something for that space. And at first we thought we'd hang books from the ceiling. We just have lots of books so you'd kind of be walking through and there'd be this wonderful display. And then the more we thought about it, the more we came across the idea somehow between us that we would like to have an old book form, a scroll that would be huge, and it would go all the way through the barrel vault, and it would hang over some pieces of something that would hang there, and that it could come down under the lights, because there were some big hanging lights that were sort of ugly, we thought, and they were sort of in the way if you wanted to hang something. So we had the scroll go under the lights, and then it came up again, and then it came down, it went down again. And there are 2 or 3. And the idea then, with thanks to another daughter, who we were looking for something to write on the scroll, and we wanted to write it in zeros and ones, so we would be embracing the earliest book form, which is a scroll, to the most recent communication form of a book is electronic on a computer. And we were looking for something to write, and our daughter Elizabeth, Rachel's sister, who's read everything in the world and is so smart. Oh, she's just so much fun. And she said, well, what about Philip Larkin? What about, he was a librarian at one time. In fact, I think he was most of the time.
Yes,
He was a
yes.
poet.
Yeah.
And he had written a poem about libraries. And she said, I'll find it for you. And she did. And it was the perfect thing. And we did the whole thing in zeros and ones. And it was, let's see, new eyes each year find old books here. And old eyes too, new books renew. So youth and age, like ink and page, in this house join, minting new coin. So we had been able to take the idea of the book going from being the oldest form into this wonderful, and that was the big thing about the Tisch Library, was that it was because all newly built were carrels and places for people to do all kinds of computer research.
This brings us to the subject of Annisquam, where you've lived for the last, at least in the summers, and then full-time the last 60 some odd years.
Right.
John, how did Annisquam strike you when you first encountered it?
On the positive side, a strong commitment to family. And I come from a large family, close. And so that was immensely attractive to me. And it transcended generations. And here, of course, I learned that 5 generations of families have played together on the beach next door here. So that seemed to be quite reassuring, but I was not familiar with a maritime oriented society, shall we say, which Annisquam is. dedicated to sailing and tennis and so forth. I grew up in Maplewood, New Jersey, a suburb of New York. We didn't do those things. I didn't know how. Anyway, all that was a revelation. But I did know or found that I enjoyed a number of people who lived here beyond the family. It was a formal society, more so than I was accustomed to. I came down without a tie and jacket, and Alden French, my future uncle, was kind enough to lend me a tie so I could be respectable for the weekend, because there were parties at lunch as well as dinner. It was quite amazing. The cocktail range here in Annisquam seemed to be quite important. And also, it's not a diverse culture by any means. It's a bubble. It's a bubble of privilege, white privilege, of which we're, of course, increasingly conscious now. And there's a big difference in caste, too, I think, between people who lived here year-round and these summer folk who came down, privileged people who, in the old days, would bring their servants with them for the summer. Irish maids would come down with the family and spend the summer here. And some people commuted, not daily. That did not come until Route 128 was put in. But people would come down maybe in the middle of the week as well as weekends.
My grandfather used to come
Yeah.
down Wednesdays,
That's right.
and then he'd come down on the weekend.
And your father told me that he and Juliet, his second wife, had a conversation once about his father, Hollis French, and they discovered they had one thing in common. They were both afraid of him. And Pop was very nervous about Wednesday night when his father would come down from Boston and hear a record of what he had done and not done during the week in his father's absence. Anyway, but I think Hollis French, who died in 1940, was a rather formidable personality. Really put his stamp on that family, which lingered over the generations. And of course, we have some of his belongings because he was an ardent collector of early American furniture and silverware and so forth. He was a connoisseur. He really had a fine eye for quality.
Early bureaus and highboys, he'd find them in barns. They were just out, with the cow manure and the hay and everything else. And he'd say, well, what about what's in your barn? Oh, it's just old furniture. Yeah, well, yeah, you can have that. You can take that. So he really was very smart at, and my father sometimes went with him to look for those things. So that was interesting.
He was not a rich man, but he had a very cultivated taste.
Holly, what is your impression of John seeing Annisquam for the first time? How did he deal with it?
Oh, I was totally unaware that it was anything.
Oh no, he took me to
unusual.
the shoe store and I bought a pair of
Oh, really?
sneakers.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, he only had brown shoes,
Yeah.
leather shoes. Yeah.
Now, did we announce our engagement that weekend?
No.
No,
We had 4 dates.
4 dates before we were married. We were married in September and we met again in June. So it was, shall we say, quite a rapid courtship.
Mm-hmm.
And someone in the family murmured, well, do you think this wedding is necessary so soon?
We talked a little bit about the strange kind of contradiction between Annisquam being a rather formal place and a place of a lot of partying and a lot of drinking and a lot of playing.
Yeah, a resort for
Yeah.
summer folk, they came for vacation. Although there were some academics who came, and I think they participated less in that more ritualized pattern of lunches and dinners and cocktail parties and so forth.
A funny story about, and John, you can remember it better than I can, because Judd Gale told us about it, about my grandfather coming over
Oh, yeah.
at noon, came over to the Gales and said, just to say, we're making mint juleps on our porch, come on over. And they had all just assembled in the dining room for dinner, and everybody said, great. And they jumped up and they came over. And
whereas Judd's mother, grandmother was a teetotaler, and she was absolutely appalled.
And she was very upset. It was time for lunch.
And people chose to drink instead.
So, but we have an interesting connection with the Gales, because now let's see, you can go back, you're better, but my father's sister Rue married Windsor Gale when both of and they were next door neighbors as young people.
Right.
But both of them had a spouse who died, but each one had taken care of his or her spouse for quite a while before they died. And they were both alone, one living in, Cincinnati or Cleveland? I can't remember where he lived.
Yeah.
Where Windsor. Cincinnati, I think. And Rue was in Denver, Boulder. And Isabel Sargent said one day to Windsor, when you are going back to Cincinnati, you really should be probably going out to the West Coast to see your son, Jemmy. And obviously you'll be going right through Denver. Well, not necessarily, but anyway. And you really should stop and see Rue, because it would give her such a lift. She's very lonely and she's sad because Alden just died. And so Windsor did. He stopped to see his old friend, Rue Gale, not then Gale, Rue McGrew. And they married later next year or something. And so we had, at that time, we began to get to know some of the Gale family, and you figured out something interesting.
Oh, well, we had a babysitter from the Gale family, one of Windsor's, Judd's grandchildren came over to babysit. And this was, I've forgotten exactly when, but I said, oh yeah, I know your father and your grandfather and your great grandfather and your, let's see, it went back 5 generations.
It did.
Because I met Lyman Gale, who was Windsor's father, in the summer of 1957.
So it was Lyman, Windsor,
Judd, Ben, and
Sam. Yeah.
5 generations.
Yeah.
He wasn't at all impressed.
That you knew his
But
grandfather.
being a historian, I was just really amazed. Imagine knowing 5 members, 5 generations of a family.
Let's talk a little bit about the French family's relationship with Annisquam and the history. How did they start to come down here?
Mr. Bradley, and let's see, Brooks Stevens, there was a family, there were those 3 families who all built their houses about the same time, and they were all from Boston, I think, or Boston area. And that's how they happened to come. They came as summer folk, never stayed on. And they actually built the old Wharf tennis courts. Those three, I don't know, there may have been other people involved in it at the same time, but they were the ones who got it going, I think. Maybe the history group can tell us what really happened. But we always thought that that was sort of our tennis court. I think there's something interesting about the Hollis French thing. I just am remembering that my father once got a phone call, and he didn't recognize the person's voice, and the person said he wanted to speak to Hollis French, and my father said, "Well, do you want to speak to me or my daughter or my nephew or my great nephew or my grandson? Or, well, you can't speak to my father. He died in 1940. They're all Hollis French." And the person said, "Well, I want to talk to the one that plays the cello." And that was my father. But he just couldn't, since he didn't know this person and he didn't know who he wanted to speak to, he had the fun of giving a guy a hard time. He had a very good sense of humor, but my father did.
Oh, wonderful sense of
Just
humor.
wonderful.
You also told me a story about your grandmother packing up for the winter.
Oh yeah, well that was it. Yeah, at the big house, they had a big grand piano, and when she left for the winter, she put all the silverware in the piano on felt and covered it all up, and then she wrote a note on top that said, "This silver is all plated," and put the lid down on the piano, and off they went to Boston, just in case.
So that one Chester Square, is that where you lived when you were in Ennisquam when you were younger?
When I was younger,
When you were married, when you were married.
when we were married, my father was in Chester Square. But when I was a child, I mean, a teenager growing up, we were pretty much up at the big house.
Yes.
And actually, I was I had a fish boat, and I loved sailing it, and it was a pretty fast boat. My brother had bought it from the Lowe's, from Johnny Lowe, and he had done very well with it. And then my brother moved into a Lightning, and I got the fish boat. And I was not doing that well in the races because I didn't really know anything about racing. And one day at one of these cocktail parties, my father said to Sidney Gleason, they were talking, and Sidney said, "Oh," he said, "I'd love to get out there in a boat. I would like to beat those Meachams." And my father said, "Well, you know, Holly has got a fish boat and she's just learning how to race. And I bet she'd love to have a crew that really knows something about racing in Annisquam." And my father said, "Here, Holly," and he brought me over and we talked. She said, "Sidney would be willing to crew for you and he knows a lot about racing." And I said, "Okay, I don't know, I don't care." And so Sidney Gleason taught me racing, and he was so competitive. I sailed the boat, but he told me everything to do. And oh my gosh, we cleaned up. He'd see John Meacham and Dick, and they'd be in a fish boat. He said, "Okay, we're splitting tacks." And I'd say, "What do you mean? What do you mean?" "No, they're going that way. We're going to go this way." And he just taught me so many things about racing, and he loved beating the Meachams. He thought if a French and a Gleason could beat the Meachams, that you'd really be a good sailor. So anyway, it was fun.
Well, to me, that is a great Annisquam story. Well, I was going to ask you to describe something of your childhood, Holly, in Annisquam. You've covered some things.
Well, I think that one of the things that fascinates me now is how many friends my children have from being in Annisquam. I mean, they've partly because of the yacht club, I think, and also because down in Chester Square, you kind of know, you go everywhere in the village. Whereas I grew up at the foot of Squam Rock Road, and I played with my cousins. That was it, pretty much. Just, I didn't know that Norwood Heights existed, or Rockholm. I mean, they were like foreign countries. It was just the little tennis court, beach, and
Neighborhood.
neighborhood, and children.
Let's talk about Holly's parents. Hollis French Jr. and Mary Norris
No,
French.
he was Hollis Stratton French.
He was Hollis Stratton French. Yeah.
Hollis Stratton French, sorry, and
Yeah.
Mary Norris, M.N. French. And they were the headmaster and headmistress of
Yes.
Miss Porter's school. Can you tell us a story about them or him or her?
Well, I could tell you that they were a really wonderful couple for that job. My father is very well organized, and he was a good. He had been a French teacher, and he was an academic minded person. My mother never went to college because her father said that it wasn't necessary. So her brothers both went to college, but she didn't go, and her sister didn't go. It's the back in the day, and when girls weren't necessarily allowed or encouraged. But mother was very smart. She was a terrific reader and just a really warm person. And so she used to be in charge of all the social aspects of the school. And when a student came with a terrible tears in her eyes because her mother was going to be getting a divorce and she didn't know where she was going to be living, my mother was a knitter, and she would sit at her desk and the girl would sit in a comfortable chair right next to her and tell her all the terrible things that were happening. And my mother was just so understanding, and she knitted the whole time, which is very relaxing for somebody. If you ever have a terrible story to worry about, it's just a very comfortable, motherly thing. I mean, that wasn't all she did, but I just remember that was something that the girls who needed her always found an ear.
The subject of the French house and the Wigan house, which have a strange, not a strange, but an interesting relationship with one another.
Oh, that's true. That's true. I don't know how my grandfather happened on the land at the bottom of Squam Road where he built his house, but apparently Harry Wigan was a great sailor, and he sailed by the area by the lighthouse there near where our house is, and he just loved what he saw, and he got together with some people and they bought up. I don't know who all the people were, but I'm sure it's in the Norwood.
No, I think it was Harry Wigan himself bought all this land.
Yes, it was a kind of a development. They had
Yes,
all.
it was.
Yes, it was, but I think it was more than.
It was more than him, but it was like 3 people or something.
Yeah,
Really?
yeah.
Okay.
But at any rate, he picked the 6 lots, which is what our house is on, the big house, and his architect was George C. Wales, who is who was an artist and an architect, and he was a Marine. He has a huge collection, made a huge collection of engravings, lithographs, woodcuts, watercolors of ships. And actually the Peabody Essex has quite a lot of his. Oh, he has actually the original plates that the engravings were done from, but they also have other work of his. But it turns out that this man, George C. Wales, was my grandfather's first cousin, and he built my grandfather's house, which was a sort of a colonial type style of house, but Harry Wigan's house was more of a rustic sportsman's lodge kind of a house.
And he designed that one.
He
also.
designed the same one.
Also.
And they're both designed with all the bedrooms facing the ocean, and a wing for out the side for the kitchen. So they're similar, except that their style is very different, but they're both on the water with a lawn going down to the water in both houses. Quite interesting.
So how did you come to move into the Wigan house?
How did
Oh.
that? Well, we certainly had looked at so many houses in Annisquam. Every summer, when there was anything for sale, we'd always go and look at it. And we even, I think, put in bids on a couple of houses that we didn't get because we didn't have the money for it or what they wanted. So how did we happen with the, I know what happened. We rented one summer because our family had gotten really big, much too big for the one Chester Square. And we had grandchildren and we thought it would be fun to rent. And we rented the Lyman House on the corner, the one that where Pete Kovner, I don't know how he pronounces it,
Yep.
has the house there now. And we rented it for a month and everybody came and it was fantastic. We loved it. And we said, oh, if only we had a big house where everybody could come, it would be so much fun.
And you were friends with Peg Wiggin, right? And,
Oh, yeah,
yes.
yeah,
and
yeah.
Morrill.
Very good friends.
Now we're sort of getting into anecdotes about particular people that you knew, and I wondered,
Oh.
do you have a story about Peg and Morrill Wiggin?
Oh, Isabel Sargent told me that she and Paul went up there for dinner one night, just the four of them. They were having drinks in the living room, and suddenly a large rat ran across the living room floor and up the stairs. And Peachy just laughed and said, oh, well, the cat will take care of it. So she was quite relaxed.
Oh, yeah, she was wonderful, just wonderful.
We talked a little bit about some particular people that were important to you in your lives in Annisquam. And the first one that came up was Alpheus Hyatt Mayer.
And he told me the reason he got that fantastic job at the Metropolitan Museum was not because of his knowledge of art, but languages.
And his job was?
Curator
Curator
of prints.
prints. Yeah.
An important post at that great museum.
Okay, draw us a little bit of a picture of spending time with him at that house out on the point.
Yeah.
Also, even before you begin, we might just tell our public that his father had started Woods Hole in that house, and his aunt, her name was Anna Hyatt Huntington, I think,
Yes.
made the Joan of Arc's statue. But tell us a little bit about spending time with him.
But we went there for dinner and John found out that he actually didn't drink particularly much, but that he had walked to Gloucester to buy gin so that he could offer us a gin and tonic. And we were quite taken aback by that anybody would walk to Gloucester.
So thoughtful.
Very thoughtful. But I was fascinated by at this time, he was spending the summer in the studio, and it was furnished with stuff that he picked up just wherever he could find it.
Well,
And-
Gloucester had a junkyard at that point.
Oh, is that what it was? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
okay.
where he would go for items.
And there was a coffee table that was actually the framework that a big coal stove had sat on. It was the metal legs and the framework. And he cut a piece of plywood that was the right size, and it had scalloped corners where the legs came out. And then he had covered it. He had coupaged it with tarot cards. It was charming. It was just very colorful and beautiful. And
So
And he was a childhood playmate of my father-in-law.
that's right. That's right.
They used to go back and forth.
you and I talked a little bit about how food was acquired in Annisquam when you were growing up.
They used to buy food at Ricker's Stand. There was a lovely little stand down by where the other Littlefield house where Joe lived.
Mhm.
That was the Rickers, and there was a big garden behind, I guess. and she used to get it there. And then they went to Vieta. No, they went to the Annisquam market. My grandmother's sent someone to the Annisquam market for things like, I suppose, milk and things that eggs that didn't come from Boston. But my mother, once she was running her household down in Chester Square, never went to the Annisquam market, even though it was a nice little grocery store, because she said it was much too expensive. So she went up to Vieters, which was up across and that later was the Shays store. So it was interesting and of course we ate a lot of fish and clams, and we used to go out and spear flounder. Did you ever do that? When it was dead calm at about 4 or 5 in the morning, we would row out. My father would row, and my brother and I would hold this thing, and it was at my grandmother's, standing in the what they called the chuck room, which was just the room you came in the back door, the side door. And that thing, you'd hold it up, and you'd have to be able to see, and you could see the sand on the bottom. And while the boat would move very slowly, and my father would stop rowing so there wouldn't be any ripple, and you'd watch until you saw a flounder, and you'd say, okay, here we are. And you'd take this thing, and I never was able to get it. My brother did all the time. He could keep the thing steady and get it, and didn't get it. And we would bring home flounder, and they would make flounder for breakfast. So that was exciting.
John, you ran the book table at the Annisquam Sea Fair?
Oh, for years.
My father did for quite a few
Yeah,
years.
he took over after me.
No, before you.
No,
he'd
I
been-
took over from a high school teacher who did it first.
Oh,
And then when we went off to Japan to spend time, your father took it over.
I see.
And so I was the assistant after that.
I
But
see.
I never priced anything at 15 cents. Your father would 15 cents, 20 cents. It was such a nightmare for anybody trying to make change, in the crowds, all these odd amounts for books, and he underpriced everything. And you know that Teddy Kennedy used to come down.
Oh, yes.
Come down by helicopter. Actually, it was called Wigan Airlines, but had nothing to do with the Wigan family.
Yeah. And he used to stop. He used to land over at Sis Smith's,
Yeah.
and they'd go out for clams, for fried clams. And then he'd come back, get in the helicopter, and go.
One thing I forgot to ask you about when I was asking you about the Wigan House is your experience with Olive Kittredge.
Oh, yeah. Well, they did the book, Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout, was made into a 4-part video for a series for I guess it was home. It's HBO.
Yeah.
And they let us stay. We didn't have to leave the house because they were only going to use it for a short time. I think it was really a lot of fun. And we were in the dining room looking at these monitors, big, size monitors. And they did the same scene over and over and over again. They must have done it more than 15 times. And it was Bill Murray lying in our bed, or his bed, because they put a different bed in there for him. And she comes in to visit him. And one time she comes in, they keep taking it again, says, well, you should stand here, or let's try it from a different angle. And then they said, so she comes in and he's sound asleep. And she takes the bunch of tulips that she's brought in because he's sick and whacks him with the tulips, and he comes to. Well, that did not get into the movie. That was just one of the scenes that they.
Well, I remember they filmed that 16 times.
Was it 16?
I counted.
Oh,
Those actors have enormous patience. It's
yeah.
They want to make sure that they have the right exposures on the right people who are speaking and so forth. It's really intricate.
listen, this has really been great. Thank you so much for letting us into your world, telling us so many great stories. I have a couple of sort of ending questions. How has Annisquam influenced you?
Of course, it's the site of much family happiness.
Yeah,
That's the bottom line.
yeah,
It's wedded us to our children in ways that otherwise would not have been the case, because we lived in various places. You know, I'd move according to jobs from place to place, but summers in Annisquam were always the same. And our children, some of them, the three girls, have friends here that they've had since that time, you know, their whole lives. These friendships are very important. And I think our children, those who can, and will eventually live in Annisquam, also retire at Annisquam. And I think among that generation, there is that desire. Some of them already have houses in Annisquam and plan to stay here, you know, for the rest of their lives.
And live here year round, not just summer.
Year round, yeah,
Yeah,
not just
yeah,
summer.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it binds together. The power of the community is very strong. It's artificial. We're so privileged here, you know, and thinking about the terrible impact that the pandemic is having on our society is beyond words. But here we are living safely in our confined existence, but not troubled by that at all. So we are among the most fortunate of individuals.
We were talking the other night with our children, and I remember saying that, I said, I'm so full of joy because, you know, there were, I guess it was, we were having a birthday celebration for a grandson who just turned 30. And I said, but it's very hard to accept that wonderful feeling I'm having when I look at everything around me, outside of me, how much misery there is in the world. It just is very hard to accept the fact that you're a happy person in the middle of all this. And we all talked about it that evening, how fortunate we feel to have each other and to have this Annisquam and the community, and yet to be so aware of so much chaos outside us.
How do you think Annisquam has changed in these 63 years?
Oh, hugely. Well, there's a wonderful sense of, there's the Good Neighbors and the Sewing Circle and the Leonard Club. They're all groups of people who care about each other and care about the community. And it's very, very comforting, especially at our age.
Yeah.
We worry about the future, but not too much, because we don't have a huge future. It's our children's future that we have to worry about, I guess.
John, you're a historian, and I'd be curious if you could tell a story about Annisquam as a historian and put it into some kind of historical perspective. What would you write?
Well, it's an ancient settlement, of course, going back to the 1700s. And its great days of glory commercially were in the age of shipbuilding that kept the village going. But then as we moved into the age of industry, Annisquam was left behind. And I'm sure there's some grim stories attached to families who tried to survive perhaps on local resources. Maybe they could do a bit of fishing, but fishing moved to Gloucester, which had a much bigger port. And then Gloucester got the railroad in the 1830s, and that left Annisquam very much isolated from the outside world. But then a time of rescue came in the latter part of the 1800s when people had summer vacations and began to come here. Artists were very important in that movement, I think. And many great resorts were started by artists like Newport, for example. And the age of the boarding house or the summer hotel, those are very important places. And then the transition came in the 20th century when people began to build big houses and the whole geography of the village changed because people wanted to be up here on the sea if possible, or with a water view. That added a new perspective. And that saltwater perspective is very important. Even at Mount Adna Cemetery, I understand, lots with a water view are priced more highly than those without. So just for your reference for the future. So then Route 128 came, and that changed our relationship to Boston because people could commute.
Mhm.
And some few even lived here more year round. And there was less difference between those who lived here year round and the summer folk too. The caste system of former times more or less disappeared, I'd say.
Mhm.
But now, of course, with the infusion of wealth, at least for some in this society, I just wonder what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
Hard to buy a house for less than $1 million in Enniskillen now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
We still have this wonderful environment which we can enjoy, and we are enjoying right now to the fullest. So
Mhm.
let's be positive about it. We have a great community. It's not going to be changed, I think.
Well, that's a good thought.